breath.
So, a medicine circle, what exactly is that? Now, it really does depend on the geographical context, the cultural context, and the traditional context. I invite you to inquire into this for yourself, and this can be a journey throughout your life as you acquire more information, more skills, more exposure to other cultures and traditions and places around the world. Allow this to change and allow it to be flexible and fluid. So I'm going to provide one format that can be quite useful to anchor into the natural world. So, based on the foundation of animism, where everything has a soul, everything is alive, which is largely the context that we work within with cacao, where we're acknowledging the spirit of the plant, not only the plant being a living entity itself, but that it has a spirit. So too does the rock that it grows next to, the other trees around that, the water element that feeds it, nourishes it, the rain from the sky. So we refer to everything having a soul or a spirit, an ensouled world. This is animism. Now, many traditions, I would I would go as far as saying most and all traditions actually stem from animism. This deep connection that humans have known to nature for thousands of years. Only recently, in our post-industrial, more modern culture, have we started to disconnect from nature, which is causing quite a few problems in itself. So the idea of creating a medicine circle is more around remembering. We all know this in our DNA because our ancestors used to create medicine circles all the time, no matter what our current tradition is. So even if you don't find yourself in an indigenous culture where medicine circle is part of the traditions or the rituals, where you haven't been trained in anything like this, I'm going to provide you with a way of connecting into the natural world and a lovely way to just set up a very sacred, but a very profound and held medicine circle. So it's important that we orientate ourselves into the natural world, i.e., the earth and its cycles or her cycles. So the sun will always rise in the east, no matter where we are on the globe. It'll always set in the west, no matter where we are on the globe. And it's really important that we find these two cardinal directions wherever we are to orientate ourselves into the location that we find ourselves in. So right now I'm sitting in South Africa. I could be having a conversation to someone in England, someone in Indonesia, someone in Australia, someone in the Americas, and we will all acknowledge the East and the sun rising there, the West and the sun setting there. So already here, these are 2 points that can anchor you into a medicine circle, the East and the West. And of course, the other two cardinal directions that would then complete that are the North and the South. Now, this does change depending on what hemisphere you're in. I'm not going to get too much into the details of how we would then create the medicine circle because the direction does become important over time. But for starters, just acknowledge the four cardinal directions. So you have your east, you have your north, you have your west, you have your south. And you are going to physically map that in the physical space that you want to have your ceremony or your ritual in. So what I normally do is I arrive at a space, even if it's a space in nature, a space at a venue that I'm using for ceremony, a space in my home. Even if I've used that space before or been there and held ceremony before, I first connect into the location. So I literally take myself, my physical body, and I sit. I sit down in where I think the center is going to be. And I just connect. I connect by engaging with my breath, by relaxing into my body. And I just allow myself to open up, of course, into the heart space. And I just listen. Sometimes I don't hear anything, but other times I get a very strong message that I need to really be focused in on a certain direction. Or I get a feeling that where I'm sitting is not really supposed to be the center. It should be over there a little bit more. Or that today's ceremony mustn't be in the shape of a circle. So, all of this is nice information that can come by just giving ourselves a few minutes to land, to ground in that temple space that we are then going to be creating in a very sacred welcome for others and for spirit. So I sit in the space and I orientate myself. Most of the time, I'm very switched on with where the sun rises, anyways. So I'll try and just face my body towards the east where the sun rises. I land there and I'm very aware that behind me is the west. And then in the southern hemisphere, my left side, I will have the north. My right side, I will have the south. Northern hemisphere, those two will be reversed. Nonetheless, I have 4 corners or 4 directions. And this can really be a nice way of mapping the circle. Of course, the circle is a circle, right? Where's the start? Where's the end? It doesn't have. That's the whole point of a circle. We're all equal within that, and it's a continuum of life and cycles. But I like to just acknowledge where the east is, where the north is, where the west is, where the south is, either by in the circle or around the edges of the circle, placing objects there. So there'll be 4 main objects there, or having a line of some sorts going from the center to the outside of the circle, in that direction, in that direction, in that direction, in that direction. So if you had to view this from above, you would see a cross, the meeting point of everything in the center where I'm sitting when I begin. Right. Now, when I'm holding space, I'm not going to be sitting in the center of that circle. I'm going to be along the edges around the center with everybody else. As a space holder, I'm very conscious of which seat I put myself in, which direction I anchor myself in. This becomes a bit more intuitive over time, but you might want to just for yourself have a little dialogue around this. What does the East mean to me? What are some elements that come up there? Some associations, any spirit animals associated with that space, any elements. Does fire sit in one particular direction for you? Does water sit very obviously in another direction? So on and so forth. So when I'm deciding where I want to sit within that center space, I can anchor myself in the west, for example, for whatever reason I've decided, or I just feel that that's the place I really want to just be in for the ceremony. And I trust that. I trust the feelings and the intuition, as well as listening to the logic of the mind. Because maybe it's not practical for me to have my back to the door where people are walking in from. But that's where I thought I might be or felt I might want to be. So I've got to kind of also just use the head and the heart, the emotions, the intuition, all of this to consider my placement within the circle as the space holder, but also to acknowledge the orientation in the natural world. There is the east, that's where the sun rises. There is the west, that's where the sun sets. Not only the sun, this is where the moon, the ecliptic that the moon moves on, and it's how we are moving in the galaxy. So we see the Milky Way as well, and the stars aligning largely around this ecliptic. Of course, the sun is a very important feature, the fire element. Now, again, northern and southern hemisphere are going to be opposites with this. In the southern hemisphere, when I am looking towards the north, I'm seeing the sun element very strong. So if I'm going to be placing a fire object in the direction of north, that's very much mapped into the natural world. It'll be the opposite if I'm sitting in England and I'm largely looking at the sun the whole time as being more in the south. Then I'm going to place the fire element and everything around that in the southern direction. If that's too confusing, just don't worry about those directions. I'm just using the element of fire because the sun is very prominent. And the fire element is what holds us during ceremony. So it brings us together and ignites and activates spirit within us and also in other objects, other things. Which is why largely we place the candle in the center of the circle. Or if you're working with an open fire, you make that fire in the center of the circle. You don't really place it in one of the directions. You can have candles to anchor in the directions on those 4 corners within the circle. And you can also have the candle in the middle. So I'm very fond of using fire quite a lot, whether it's represented in the candle or whether it's actually a contained fire or a very open fire out in nature. It really does anchor us all in around that centerpiece. So there's going to be a centerpiece. Now, this is where I was going to be, where I sat. If I'm creating a circle or medicine circle for a ceremony, I arrive into the space and I sit there. Now, I'm not going to be sitting there in ceremony, like I said, but this is largely going to be the focal point for everybody's view, but also where the energy goes. It's the most charged part location-wise of the ceremony, because everything is directed towards the center. So that centerpiece, you can think of that as the altar or the shrine. Now, this is within the medicine circle. So it's really important to see this whole place that you are creating as the sacred container. And you can work with sacred geometry there. You can start just with that cross idea, and you can really map some, excuse me, some beautiful mandalas, for example, with colored petals, flowers, sand, soil, leaves. Bringing in nature as much as possible is always going to be very beneficial for our work there in that sacred space. But if you don't have access to a lot of the nature spaces, it doesn't matter. Use whatever you have available to you and anchor yourself in to the cross that represents the lines and the directions into the directions within the container of the circle. And then you choose as the space holder which directional seat you want to be sitting in. It might not be practical every single time to have the seat that you want or you feel you would like to be in. Practically, you might have to be facing a certain way just because that's the orientation of the room in a venue that you are unfamiliar with, that you arrive into. So it's a good idea to give yourself a little bit of time just to land before starting to unpack things and start to create things and get everything going. And especially if you have some help, it's good for you to land, pause, and then just be clear on what it is you want in terms of that structure. It's like the skeleton, really is the skeleton, this cross with the circle around it. Once you've got that clear in your mind, or an idea of that, then you start fleshing that out. Now, I've already said we want to acknowledge the elements. So I gave the example of fire. You can, of course, place fire in one of the directional points within that circle, or you have that in the center, or both. I really would always advise to have a candle or some representation of fire in the center, because it helps to anchor everybody in and activate, also going outwards from there. You want to acknowledge the element of water. So again, you can either place this somewhere on the line, on the direction that where for you water links into a direction, or again, have it in the centerpiece. Have an offering or an invocation to air. So incense is always a good one. Any herbs that are going to be burnt, any oils, resins. So the idea that air is always present, of course, we're breathing it, but to have something physical that can anchor that in. And then, of course, earth. Now, this should be an easy one because most of the time we're going to be working with stones or crystals or sticks or flowers. So the element of earth is hopefully quite strong already in your ceremony. But if it isn't, perhaps you want to just think about bringing with you and placing into the center or along the line of the direction that you think earth would best be suited. You bring something with. Maybe there's a special statue that you have. Most of the time, statues are made from natural materials. Perhaps it's a feather, which also can represent air, the bird taking flight on the wind, a flower, a crystal, a stone, pieces of jewelry. All these are of the earth, element of the earth. Now, where to place what element in what direction, I haven't really given too much instruction on this, apart from fire, depending on if you're the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, it would be wherever you are largely looking at the sun. And there's a reason for this, because the medicine circle and its mapping is always going to be geographically specific to that tradition, that culture, that time. For example, if I lived in an indigenous culture where the wind came from a certain direction, let's say the wind came from the direction of the south, and the wind brought in the rains, and this then gave the abundance to the soil that life could just start to grow from. Then there's quite a loaded story already there just for the direction of south. Of course, my people then are going to associate south possibly with the air element because of that wind, but probably more so with the water element because the wind brings the rain. the ceremony to call or invoke that or to acknowledge that will be done at a certain time of year, of course, when that wind starts to blow. So there'll be a very specific ceremony done to acknowledge that turn in the seasons. And this is how ceremony has always been used, to acknowledge the changing in the seasons, to be living with nature and amongst nature, as part of nature, and to either invoke and pray for something, to give gratitude for it. So that's going to be for my people of that time. Now, it could be at the same time, another time, but across the globe, somewhere else, completely unrelated, there would be another culture, and they have a massive body of water, let's say the ocean or a lake, that is in the northern direction for them, depending on where they are geographically located. So for them, the water element is going to be sitting in the north and not the south. The sun rising often is associated with air just because it's the rising up. It's one of the ascending elements. And there's a freshness, there's a newness. There's that first breath of life, of potential. And because the sun sets in the west, no matter where we are in the globe, the west is often associated with certain understanding of entering into the nighttime space, of course, the subconscious, the dream space. And this links beautifully into our work with spirit, with our ancestors. And so there's an element there of water, of allowing the flow into that space, into the dream space, into the subconscious. So there's so many ways that we can link in an element into a direction. What doesn't change, though, are the directions. There will always be an anchoring in to the east, to the north, to the west, to the south. Remember, this is your skeleton, and that's contained within a circle. That doesn't change. Fleshing that out is going to be, or has been historically, geographically and cosmologically specific. So bear that in mind when you start to find information on the internet, or when someone has a very strong opinion of this needs to be done this way. Not always so. It depends on where that information has come from, and that would have been from a people's that were located and contained in one place. Nowadays, we get to travel a lot. We have access to a lot of information, which is beautiful. So just take it all within context. Coming back to creating your own medicine circle, you can really go as profound as you like with this. You can really get very visual. So like I've already said, bringing in flowers, bringing in parts of nature. These are not only bringing it in to make it look nice, but they're also offerings. They're offering back to the land. On that note, when we are finished with our ceremony, we don't just sweep it all up and chuck it in the bin. Anything that's biodegradable, that's an eco-friendly offering, take it either later that day or the next day. So collect it all, put it in a bag or a box or a plate, and take it back to nature. If you don't live close to nature, you might want to make a special trip for this. And it's very beautiful. You can create a whole cacao ritual around this. Prepare yourself a little picnic and take yourself off with your journal and gift this back to the land in a very ceremonial way. If, of course, you're having a ceremony in nature and that space can stay there, then everything that gets put into the center of the circle essentially is the offering that stays there. So that's a very beautiful, might not be possible all the time to have context. And I wish for everybody to experience that one day. For example, making the fire on the land, placing the offerings around and into the fire, allowing the prayers to be taken up very naturally through the smoke. And then everything afterwards settles and it rests there and it lies there. We don't pack anything up, so to speak, unless it's going to be litter for the land. And of course, if you have a garden or you have a piece of nature close by, then really get into a beautiful habit of doing this. Even if it's a water body, you can place the rose petals, for example, if they're rose petals. You can just slowly offer them to the water while singing, while sipping on your cacao. So this becomes an extension of your ceremony. It's important that we also acknowledge the duality in our medicine space. So what I mean by this is the yin and the yang, the masculine, the feminine, or the feminine, the masculine, the nighttime, the daytime, the polarities that largely rule us in this life and create the cycles, of which the most obvious ones are day and night. And then this leads into the seasonal changes as well. And again, this is the idea that we are always connecting into nature. So somewhere in that medicine circle or in the centerpiece, to have some representation here of the polarities. And this can come in very easily if we're already giving an offering of fire and an offering of water, because these are polarities. Often the fire is associated with the masculine force, the water with the feminine force. If you want to have representations of that in a different way, by all means. And in the space as well, you might want to bring in any other allies that you work with in a representation form. For example, if you have spirit animals that you work with, then you might want to have some way of acknowledging that in the space. Of course, your invocation to them through words and through song is also beautiful when you are holding and opening up that ceremony. But to actually have a representation of them and build up your altar and your medicine circle kit over time is a beautiful thing to stay connected to. For example, if you work with sacred herbs, you might want to start preparing those herbs a few weeks before to dry them out and make sure they're in the best energetic way that we can be offering them. And the shape within the middle can also change. Now, Chakana is a very traditional shape that you may have seen in some of the Mesoamerican cultures. The circle is the most common one. And then in some of the Asian cultures, there are mandalas, which are also very, very beautiful. All the sacred geometry that comes together here. So this is really just an introduction into creating the medicine circle. You can see how there can just be more and more and more added to this. The most important thing is that it's not empty. We're not just putting something there because we think it looks nice and it's going to impress the people coming. It needs to mean something to us, no matter how bizarre it may look. I've gone to ceremonies where there has been a complete eclectic mix of very tribal objects and then plastic Barbie dolls. And one would think, well, what does the one have to do to the other? But if you had to engage with the space holder afterwards, they'd be able to kind of explain why those objects are there for them and they're important. They help us as a space holder to remain more grounded and centered in, because if we are bringing together all our allies and we are seeing them the whole time in ceremony, a reminder to us that it's not just the object there, that object that we're looking at is the representation of the spirit, then it does really help us remain in the connected space of we are there as a team with spirit, with all our energy allies. And it's a nice thing to introduce this. So the participants that come, they might be very unfamiliar with everything they are seeing there. It can sometimes cause a little bit of a barrier for them just to open up, especially if they have a strong trigger for certain objects. So just to speak to them, exactly like I've shared here, we acknowledge that we are anchoring in from the direction. So we acknowledge the north, the south, the west, the east. We also acknowledge that we're sitting in a circle and that we are all equal here. And this represents the cycles of life. There's a representation and an offering to each of the elements. It doesn't matter where they're placed. They can just be placed in the circle. And you'll speak to the fire, the water, the air, the earth. There's candles as well, obviously representing fire, but that we ignite the spirit in all things when we light a candle. And then the polarities that we work with in here, the day and the night, or the yang and the yin. And working in a ceremony where we are serving cacao and we're working with cacao as a medicine, please have a representation of cacao and the spirit of cacao in your centerpiece in the ceremony. So if you have access to cacao beans, it's a really nice idea to have a bowl with the beans there, or you can create a nice little shape around like a little representation of a mandala with the cacao beans. Please have a bowl there for Ish Cacao, for the goddess of cacao, that either you pour an offering into before your participants arrive as you're setting up that space, or when you come to the drinking ritual with the other humans in the circle, that you also give an offering to Ish Cacao. Another way of working a little bit more traditionally with cacao in the space is to have the polarity there, cacao being the feminine and corn being the masculine. So you could have a piece of corn represented in there, or something that is of the harvest, because cacao and um, her traditional wouldn't say use, but understanding was that she was the goddess of fertility and also of the harvest. So it's to keep acknowledging the history and the origins, and this can come into the medicine circle and the sacred space we create within that. And also just for us to remain inspired, to keep learning. So I wish you a beautiful setup of your medicine circle. Please remember that there's no right or wrong way of doing this. The most important thing is that it comes from you, from your essence, from your heart. To make beauty is to make sacred. So make it beautiful. Take your time with it. Really take your time to prepare for this space. Bring in any other divination tools you want. If you work with oracle cards, for example, if you throw certain objects that land in certain directions and places, you know, speak to that and go for it. If you have other offerings from certain traditions largely across the world, giving an offering of tobaccos for the ancestors, giving an offering of salt as well for the spirit, giving an offering of water for the dreaming mind. So there's so many beautiful other offerings that we can bring in here that make our space very, very layered with a lot there. At the very least, everyone's going to be intrigued and completely present with what's there. And at the most, they're going to feel the presence of everything there and your authentic connection to it. And they're going to feel that throughout the ceremony as you are able to hold yourself within your team of spirit allies. That's just a representation in the medicine circle that we are going to be creating. So have fun with this. And afterwards, please take that space gently, lovingly, and with reverence. And whatever can be gifted back to nature, gift it back to nature. Make this a continuation of your ceremony.